The sun had just begun its slow, lazy climb over the rooftops of Miami Gardens. A warm, humid light, the kind that promises a bright, sweltering day, filtered through the rustling palm fronds. The air was thick with the scent of dew-kissed grass and the distant hum of traffic waking up. For 72-year-old Doreen Richard Broadbelt, this was the most peaceful part of her day. The quiet moments before the city roared to life. The rhythm of her footsteps on the sidewalk was a familiar, comforting beat. But as the world around her slept, something was watching from the shadows. Something she knew, something she feared. A low growl cut through the stillness. A sound not of an animal on the hunt, but of a territorial menace. A warning she had heard before. It was a sound that had become a part of her daily anxiety. A shadow on her peaceful mornings. And today, that shadow was about to break free. The stick she carried in her hand, a simple gift from a worried daughter, suddenly felt useless, a fragile piece of wood against a force of pure, untethered aggression. In an instant, the gentle morning ritual would become a frantic, desperate struggle for survival. A mother, a grandmother, a kind soul with a decade of service to her community, was about to face a horror she had seen coming for months, but could never truly prepare for. Some stories start with a bang. A car crash, a sudden tragedy, a scream in the night. This story begins with a quiet walk, a walk to work like thousands of others that came before it. It's the kind of routine that anchors a life, a simple, ordinary act of getting from here to there. But what happens when that routine becomes a stage for terror? When a peaceful path turns into a killing ground? We all have things we do every day without thinking. We open the front door, we walk to our car, we take the same route. We trust that the world, for the most part, will stay in its predictable lane. But for Doreen Richard Broadbelt, the predictable lane was hiding a monstrous secret, a threat that wasn't new, but was ignored, a danger that had been roaming free for too long. This is the story of a nightmare that was written on the walls of her neighborhood, a tragic end that could have been prevented. It's the story of how a kind, loving woman went on a simple walk and never came home, because the very animals she feared the most were the ones waiting for her. And the most chilling part of all? The owners of those dogs still haven't been found. Doreen Richard Broadbelt was not defined by her age. At 72, she was a fixture of her community, a familiar face with a warm smile and an open heart. She had spent a decade working at a nearby Walmart, a job she cherished not just for the stability, but for the countless people she met every day. She was the one who helped a confused customer find the right aisle, the one who offered a gentle word of encouragement, the one who knew the regulars by name and asked about their families. She didn't see it as just a job. It was a way to connect, to serve, to be a small part of something bigger. Her life was built on routine and love. Every morning, like clockwork, she would get up, get ready, and set out for her walk to work. It was a ritual that had become a form of quiet meditation. The familiar streets of Miami Gardens, the sunrise painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, the chirping of birds. It was her time. Her family was the center of her universe. Her children, her grandchildren. She was a proud, doting matriarch, the one everyone turned to for comfort and advice. She was the anchor, the steady, reliable presence in a world that often felt chaotic. But the chaos had been creeping into her world, slowly, quietly, on four legs. For months, the peaceful tranquility of her morning walk had been disrupted. Whispers in the neighborhood had turned into worried conversations. The sight of a stray dog here, another there, had become a regular and unsettling occurrence. For a woman who spent her life helping others, this new reality was a source of constant unease. She had a kind heart, a loving heart, a heart that would break for any animal in need. But these were not animals in need. They were something else entirely. She tried to tell herself they were harmless, that they were just lost. But the way they moved, the way they watched, the low, guttural sounds they made when she passed, it was a feeling in her gut that she couldn't ignore. Her daughter had seen the fear in her eyes, the stories Doreen would tell, the times she had to change her route, the frantic way she would talk about the ghost dogs, that seemed to appear and disappear in the night. The daughter, worried and helpless, had done the only thing she could think of. She had bought her mother a walking stick, a simple, sturdy piece of wood. It wasn't meant to harm, only to ward off. A last-ditch effort to give her mother some sense of security on a route that was becoming less and less safe. Doreen, ever the pragmatist, had taken the stick. She held it with a sense of purpose, a small shield against an unknown threat. But the truth was, she knew it would do little if the worst came to pass. It was a symbol, not a solution. The problem wasn't just hers either. It was a problem for the whole community. Other residents had seen the same dogs, the phantom pack, the animals that seemed to live in the spaces between houses, in the untended corners of the neighborhood. Their presence was a quiet, shared terror. Parents kept their children inside. People hurried to their cars with keys clutched in their hands. The fear was palpable, a collective anxiety that hung in the humid Miami air. Everyone knew they were there, everyone had a story, but no one had the solution. The dogs that haunted Miami Gardens were not a single breed, but a sinister collection. They were a pack of phantoms, a roaming menace with no visible owner. Neighbors described them as a mix of large breeds, a pit bull-type dog with a scarred face, a lean mastiff mix with dark, watchful eyes, a smaller, wiry animal with a high-pitched bark that seemed to signal the others. They were a brutal, silent unit. They moved with a chilling, predatory grace. They did not bark to announce their presence, but to warn of their territory. Their movements were swift, their focus laser-like. They had a singular purpose that went beyond mere hunger. The pack was a complete system. The leader, a massive, muscular creature, would hold its head low, its gaze locked on its target. The others would fan out, circling, cutting off escape routes. These weren't strays searching for food. They were a dangerous, organized force. Witnesses who had encountered them before described a chilling intelligence in their eyes, a gleam of something that went beyond animal instinct. They knew the streets. They knew the shortcuts. They knew the routes people took. They were an urban predator, a terrifying new apex in a world that had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. The warnings were subtle, but they were there. A discarded piece of clothing, a torn-up trash can, a fleeting glimpse of a snarling face in the morning fog. These were not random acts of aggression. They were deliberate, strategic acts of dominance, and their next target was already on her way to work. The warnings had been coming for weeks, a slow, terrifying escalation of a problem everyone had tried to ignore. The first sign was the low growl from behind a hedge that had startled Doreen so much she had almost dropped her walking stick. She had brushed it off, telling her daughter it was probably just a stray, but her heart had pounded in her chest for the rest of the day. Then there was the time the pack had emerged from a vacant lot, blocking her path entirely. Their eyes, she later told her family, were cold, empty things, like black marbles. She had stood there, frozen, her stick held out in front of her until they had, for no clear reason, simply turned and disappeared back into the shadows. Her daughter, who had given her the stick, was increasingly frantic. "Mom, please, just take an Uber," she had pleaded. "It's not safe anymore." But Doreen, a creature of habit and stubborn resilience, had waved her off. "I'm not afraid of some dogs," she had said, a lie she told herself more than anyone else. "They're just lost. They don't mean any harm." She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. The alternative was a world where a simple walk to work was a gamble with her life. The final unspoken warning came just a few days before the tragedy. A neighbor, a young man who had lived in the area for years, had cornered her as she was getting her mail. He had his own story of the pack, of how they had chased him to his front door, their claws scratching on the concrete. "Please, Mrs. Broadbelt," he had said, his voice shaking. "Be careful. They're getting worse." She had smiled kindly, but her heart had sunk. The fear wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar. The city, too, had heard the roar. Animal control had received calls, but the dogs were never there when they arrived. The owners, if they existed, remained anonymous, their dangerous pets allowed to roam free, a disaster waiting to happen. The system had broken down. The people who were supposed to be safe felt vulnerable, and the ones who could have helped had failed to grasp the terrifying truth. The stage was set. The players were in place. All that was left was the final act. The morning of Monday, 2025, dawned like any other. The sun was a soft, pale orb in the sky. The clock on Doreen's nightstand read 6 a.m. She got up, dressed, and went through her usual morning routine. She made a cup of tea, packed her lunch, and put on her walking shoes. She grabbed her purse, her keys, and her walking stick, the smooth wood feeling familiar in her grip. The stick was a prop in a play she hoped would never reach its climax. She stepped out of her front door, locking it behind her with a satisfying click. The air was warm, heavy, and still. The street was quiet, empty of cars and people, just the way she liked it. She began her walk, the stick in her hand, its tip making a faint tapping sound on the sidewalk with each step. Tap, tap, tap. A steady rhythm, a comforting sound. She was about halfway to work, just past the park where children would play later in the day, when the rhythm broke. The tapping stopped. A new sound filled the air, a low, ragged growl from the hedges just ahead. Her heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the stick tighter, her knuckles turning white. She stood still, listening, her eyes darting around. The growl was a solitary sound, but she knew better. They were a pack. They were always a pack. The first dog emerged, a shadowy shape with a low-slung body and teeth bared in a silent snarl. It was the pit bull type mix. Its eyes were fixed on her, calculating. Then, from the other side of the street, the second shape appeared. A lean, dark-furred animal. They were flanking her, trapping her. The stick in her hand felt like a child's toy. The low growling intensified. Coming from both sides now, a dreadful, stereophonic sound of pure malevolence. She took a step back, her mind racing, searching for an escape. There was a house behind her, a chain-link fence. Could she make it? Could she climb it? The thought barely had time to form before the first dog lunged. She swung the stick, a desperate, clumsy arc. It connected with a sharp crack, but the dog barely flinched. The second dog moved in from behind, its teeth finding purchase on her leg. A flash of white-hot pain. A scream that was swallowed by the humid morning air. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the hard pavement. Her purse, her keys, her walking stick, they scattered around her. She was on the ground, vulnerable, exposed. The pack swarmed, the frantic, panicked sounds of a struggle, the sickening thud of bodies colliding, the tearing of cloth, the muffled sounds of fear. She tried to roll, to cover her face, to protect herself, but it was useless. The world became a blur of fur and teeth and pain. The sun, which had been so soft and gentle moments before, now seemed like a blinding, indifferent witness to the horror unfolding on the ground. A final, desperate cry was the last sound she made. And then, there was nothing. The struggle was over. The pack, having done its work, slipped back into the shadows, leaving behind a horrifying silence. The 911 call came in just moments after the attack. A terrified neighbor looking out their window saw something on the street that didn't look right. A body. Still, unmoving. They didn't see the dogs. The animals were already gone. The dispatch was urgent. A possible medical emergency. An unresponsive person on the sidewalk. Miami Gardens police and fire rescue were on the scene within minutes. The air, which had been so quiet, was now filled with the wail of sirens. When the first officers arrived, the scene was grim. They found Doreen on the ground, her body bearing the horrific evidence of the attack. The blood on the pavement was still dark and wet. The look on her face was one of pure terror, frozen in time. The officers, hardened by years of responding to violence, were shocked by the brutality of the injuries. This wasn't a simple dog bite. It was a vicious, sustained attack. Paramedics tried. They rushed to her side, working quickly, desperately, to find a pulse, to stop the bleeding, to bring her back. But it was too late. Her life had already slipped away. At 6:45 a.m., just minutes after she had started her walk, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The officers began to cordon off the area with yellow tape, a grim boundary line around a patch of sidewalk that had become a grave. Neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the sirens, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and dread. They didn't need to be told what had happened. They had all seen the ghosts on the street. the phantom pack. Now the ghost was a reality, a terrifying truth that had claimed one of their own. The investigation had begun, but the perpetrators, both human and animal, were nowhere to be found. The news hit Miami Gardens like a punch to the gut. It was on every local news station. The horrifying details of a peaceful morning turned to tragedy. The victim's name, Doreen Richard Broadbelt, was on everyone's lips. Her family, reeling from the shock, spoke to the media, their grief raw and unfiltered. They spoke of a kind, loving woman who had dedicated her life to her family and her job. They shared the painful truth about her fear of the roaming dogs, the walking stick she carried, the warnings she had voiced. She knew they were a danger, her daughter said through tears, her voice a raw whisper. I gave her the stick to protect herself, but it wasn't enough. The incident triggered a firestorm of outrage and fear. Local officials, under immense pressure, promised a swift and thorough investigation. Miami-Dade Animal Services and the police went door to door, canvassing the neighborhood, asking questions, and swabbing the mouths of every dog they could find. The DNA evidence was sent to a lab, a desperate modern-day hunt for a killer that wore no collar. The investigation was a complex and frustrating one. The dogs were a collective, a unit of terror. Without an owner to question, without a clear trail, the search was like looking for a ghost. The dogs had seemingly vanished back into the ether from which they came. The tragedy served as a brutal wake-up call for the entire community. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before were now calling into local news stations, sharing their own horrifying encounters with the pack. A protest was organized, people holding signs with Doreen's face on them, demanding action. "We can't live in fear anymore," one resident shouted at a town hall meeting. This could have been anyone. The incident became a symbol of a larger systemic failure. It was a failure of animal control to respond effectively to repeated complaints, a failure of pet owners to take responsibility, and a failure of the community to come together to address a known threat. The autopsy report was released, a cold, clinical document that detailed the extent of her injuries, a testament to the savagery of the attack. It was a final damning piece of evidence that a kind, gentle soul had met a terrifying end. The media, in a frenzy, broadcasted every detail, from the scene of the crime to the emotional interviews with her grieving family. The story resonated with people across the country, a chilling reminder that the line between order and chaos can be erased in a single, terrifying moment. The public's reaction was a mix of sorrow, anger, and a deep-seated fear that something so horrific could happen to someone so innocent, in broad daylight, on a simple walk to work. The tragedy of Doreen Richard Broadbelt is not just a story about a woman who died. It's a story about a community that let its fear become a reality. It's a story about the unseen dangers that lurk in the places we feel safest. For a kind woman who had helped so many people in her life, her final, desperate walk was a heartbreaking betrayal. The dogs she had known, the animals she had worried about, the very creatures that had become a part of her daily terror, were the ones that ultimately took her life. And today, the streets of Miami Gardens are a little quieter, the neighbors are a little more afraid, and the phantom pack, having done its work, may still be out there waiting for the next quiet morning. Because the most horrifying truth of all is that the nightmare that took Doreen's life has no name, no owner, and no consequences. It just exists, and it's still roaming free.